And welcome everyone to our webcast on workplace stress and employer obligations. I'm Joe Murphy. I'm the Managing Director, National Workplace for Australian Business Lawyers and Advisors. And with me today is Louise Hogg, our Associate Director from our Brisbane office. Welcome, Louise.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to be here.
Now, the first thing I wanted to just say is thank you to all our clients, thank you to all our staff. We were very pleased to have won on Friday night the award for being the Workplace Relations and Employment Team of the Year for the second year running under the Australian Law Awards. That was very pleasing.
It was very, very pleasing and a wonderful result for our firm. We've all worked very hard, and it's definitely a team effort that we have been able to win this 2 years in a row.
Congratulations, Lou.
Congratulations, Joe.
Thanks. Now, today, what are we going to talk about?
Look, we're going to cover off on a few things today, Joe. Everything centred around managing stress in the workplace, how to identify stress in the workplace. So we'll look about how you're going to manage stress in the workplace, because that's obviously very important. We'll then look at some of the legal things, your employer obligations under work health and safety and different pieces of legislation. And then we're going to look at, on a practical level, what causes stress? What are the symptoms of stress? How can you identify it and how can you prevent it? We'll then go on to talk about having a mental health plan in the workplace and what you can do if you think someone might be suffering from burnout. We'll then turn our minds to looking at the management of ill and injured workers with a focus on obviously those who are suffering from a mental illness or stress of some kind, and then have a bit of a chat about return to work plans.
Excellent. And one of the things that we like to talk about in these particular topics is statistics. And statistics can tell you a lot. And certainly cause a lot of concern. And in this case, just having a look through some of the statistics that are available at the moment, we looked at the cost to workplaces of mental health and mental ill health in the workplace. And in a particular KPMG report called Investing to Save, which I think was released in 2018, in that particular report, they had estimated that the cost of mental ill health in the workplace was a cost between $3,200 and $5,600 per employee. Now, that was depending on the severity of the mental ill health, but nonetheless, those are significant figures when you think about it being on a per capita basis or a per head basis. We also have some statistics around the days lost per year per employee on a per head basis as well. And again, approximately 25% of workers take time off each year for stress-related reasons, and that translates to 3.2 days per worker are lost per employee.
And certainly that could be higher in some cases.
Absolutely, absolutely. Different industries, of course, this is averaged across industries and across workplaces, and different industries have some quite high statistics. And then we also looked at the statistic of the overall cost on the economy, and it's important to understand that if that's a cost on the economy, then it's a cost on your business as well. So it's important when this is year on year increasing in terms of cost. And the statistic we found here was that in Australia, it was estimated that it was a cost of $9 billion or, and that's per year, or $373 per person, and that was based on some 2015 to 2016 statistics. We weren't able to find any up-to-date statistics that were from a reliable source at this point, but there were figures suggesting a far greater amount than that.
I have seen closer to 10.9 billion, I think, in some papers, although I don't think quite as extensive in the research as what was in the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report.
Yeah, so quite significant cost to the economy and therefore cost to your business as well. So we really collectively, both within our businesses and across society and in the community, and the business community in particular, need to spend some time and turn our minds to how we manage these issues in the workplace. We can't solve everyone's problems, but you can certainly do your bit. And hopefully some of the things we have to say today will feed into the programs and the measures you put into the workplace to manage the issues as they arise in your workplace and perhaps prevent some.
And I think one important thing we need to remember about why it's important to manage stress in the workplace is that it is so prevalent. Mental health issues in the workplace are extremely common. Some of the statistics out there indicate that 1 in 6 employees in a workplace will be suffering from a mental illness, And then in addition to that, there'll be another 1 in 6 people in the workplace who are suffering from symptoms that may result in them developing a mental illness. So with these kinds of statistics, it's not the kind of thing that we can ignore in the workplace. Also, so many people spend so much time at work now. And as much as we'd all like to say we can cut ourselves in half and say this is our work half and this is our home half, it doesn't work like that. So we need to be able to manage what's going on in a person's life because they are at work a lot of the time. I think that by understanding how much mental illness there is in the workplace, that will hopefully lessen the stigma of mental health in the workplace. Unfortunately, there's something like 54% of people who will not actually go and get any assistance or treatment when they have mental health issues. And that's really unfortunate because with treatment comes very good immediate and long-term prospects for that person in terms of management of their mental health condition.
Well, and Louise has just added to the statistics that we were looking at before, and if the statistics don't talk to your concerns about mental health in the workplace, then perhaps your legal obligations will. And we've got a little bit of a list up here about legal obligations that exist around, a broader scope of things, but for the purposes of today's discussion, mental health or mental ill health. And we've got up here in our first line, work health and safety. Some jurisdictions still call it occupational health and safety. The obligation there, generally speaking, across the jurisdictions is to ensure the mental ill health of your employees is dealt with in a healthy and safe way, so far as is reasonably practicable. And that qualification was included some years ago in a number of the pieces of legislation around the country. That obligation is quite a significant obligation. It's a general obligation. So the more specific things we talk about today really do feed into and address that work health and safety obligation that you have. The Fair Work Act also has obligations.
Yes, that's correct.
And we've got the prohibition against treating people unlawfully on the basis of a disability, and a disability includes mental health issues, even if they are temporary.
Yes, that's correct.
There is also a prohibition against taking adverse action against someone who has a mental illness or that they've exercised a workplace right in connection with their mental illness.
Correct. And in terms of the exercising of a workplace right, we tend to see that in relation to someone who's made a workers' compensation claim, who feels that they might have been treated less favourably, perhaps their employment's been terminated because they made that claim.
Yes, and that can be sometimes that, a classic scenario is, you've got to make some redundancies and the person who's on workers' comp gets selected.
Correct.
That'd be a classic scenario, one that we come across a lot. The first thing we say to clients, of course, is don't pick that person because they're on workers' comp. They need to be selected on a merit selection basis if you're going through a selection basis on who should and shouldn't be made redundant.
Correct. Also under the Fair Work Act, we've also got unfair dismissals, which is something which you need to take into consideration. In certain circumstances, someone who has an illness, whether it be a physical or mental illness, might not be fit to perform the inherent requirements of their job. And when that comes up, potentially it does create a valid reason to terminate someone, but at the same time you also need to make sure that you follow a fair process in relation to that termination.
And one of the big concerns, probably, to be honest, in my view, one of the biggest concerns is workers' compensation. And that's a topic that's close to both mine and Louise's hearts. We've both got background in doing workers' compensation matters, me focused on New South Wales and Lou focused on Queensland. But we do broadly cover the country in terms of the issues that we see across the jurisdictions from a workers' comp perspective. And they're quite significant costs around workers' compensation. In fact, it is my opinion that some of the greatest savings is around workers' compensation. When people feel stressed, suffer from anxiety, depression, stress, usually they tend to be the entry terms for mental ill health. When you go to a GP, they tend to be the holy trinity of mental ill health. That tends to be the first port of call for an individual who feels that they're not coping in the workplace. And, those costs include not just wages, but also medical expenses and sometimes permanent loss of whole body impairment as a result.
I know in the state of Queensland, in terms of per claim and the cost of claims, the cost of psychological injuries and psychological claims are far more significant than those involving people with physical claims. And the reason being, generally there's a lot longer recovery period, there's a lot more treatment involved, and, you know, a lot of the people, by the time they get to the stage of making a claim, it's become very, very serious. So we really need to watch out for those psychological claims and be looking to make early intervention so that we don't get to the point of a workers' comp claim.
Yeah, and that's why one of our topics today is also return to work.
Yes.
That tends to be more focused around workers' compensation. I know that there's a bit of a debate that rages about how quickly you get someone back to work, but if you've got the right plans and support mechanisms in the workplace, getting people back to work as quickly as possible, in my view, subject to a doctor's opinion about a person's fitness, is the best thing for them from a mental health perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Getting people back to work is very, very important. I think it makes them feel connected with the workplace, gives them a sense of purpose, and for a lot of people will actually help assist them in improving in their health.
And we've also got state and federal discrimination laws, another two layers of protection against discrimination. Every state and territory has its own piece of anti-discrimination legislation, and we have a federal piece of anti-discrimination legislation that covers mental ill health, and that's the Disability Discrimination Act.
Yes.
We won't go through all the states and territories' legislation, but they have provisions that are almost identical to the federal legislation.
Yes, and just on the Disability Discrimination Act, the Australian Human Rights Commission, over 40%, I think it's about 44% of the claims that come in during the year relate to disability discrimination. And of those complaints that are disability discrimination complaints, a quarter of them relate to mental illness, mental impairment, psychological conditions. So there is a significant number of those coming through.
And the last one we've got up there is just privacy, and it's just important to remember that information about a person that relates to their health, that's medical in nature as well, is in fact sensitive personal information and has a particular status under the privacy legislation. So it's really important that you are very careful with the information that you have about your employees in relation to their mental health, how you manage that information, not just the information you've got in black and white, but who you talk to about that person's mental health or mental ill health, depending on what term you like to use, because it's really important that you're not disclosing that information to anyone, except in circumstances where you are permitted to do so. Yes,
look, I definitely agree with that. And I suppose just from a privacy perspective and taking it down to more of a personal level, employees need to feel that they can speak about these very confidential and personal matters with their employer so that there's a relationship of openness and this can be managed in the workplace. And if you're not respecting people's privacy, then that's not going to be very successful.
And we can talk about hard legal things, Lou, but the reality is if someone feels that their privacy has been breached, because you and I can talk in a lot of detail about what the privacy laws are and how they exist under both the workers' compensation legislation.
We don't want to bore
Act.
everyone, Joe.
We don't. And how there's not really a common law obligation of privacy, although there is that District Court Queensland decision.
Yes, that's right.
That everyone talks about for the last 15 years.
We're rogue in Queensland.
Yeah. But the reality is that it's really important that your employees, your workers, are confident that you are managing the information about their health, and in this case, today's topic, mental health, with absolute confidentiality, and that they have absolute confidence that you're managing it in that manner. And the best way to do that is both through confirming it through the way you deal with them and through your policies and procedures as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
What causes stress?
Lots of things. Lots of things cause stress in people's lives. And as I was saying before, we can't divide someone in half. That you can't say this is the work person, this is the home person. We're a mixture of both and we bring everything to work. So what are some of the common workplace stresses? Change within the organisation, when you're going through restructures, potential redundancies and those sorts of things, obviously that's something that's going to cause people stress. High workloads, excessive work hours, travel, all those sorts of things cause issues. And I must say from my perspective, doing a lot of workers' comp work, one of the key issues that tend to come up a lot is in the workplace, where you have management that tend to focus on negative aspects of a person's performance and really don't praise people for when they do things well. This seems to be something that keeps coming up again and again in workers' comp claims. So I think there needs to be some balance in terms of the feedback which management are providing and giving people some positive encouragement in the workplace. Now, obviously, anything can stress people out in the workplace, and there's going to be a lot of different factors. And some of those factors that might actually be influencing stress in the workplace might be things that are going on at home. Have you had a relationship breakdown, an ill family member, loss of a loved one? There could be a myriad of things going on in someone's personal life, which is going to also influence how they perceive things going on in the workplace and how they manage them.
And I think what's really important here, Lou, is the outside of, whilst an employer can do a lot in the workplace when it comes to workplace stressors, and you've talked about some of those, when we look at non-workplace stressors, there are certain things you can do to help employees with those external stressors. And that means being understanding in the workplace, making adjustments or accommodations where you can, where it's reasonable to do so, understanding that investing in your employees with their challenges in the workplace by giving them a little bit of time here and there, allowing them to turn up late to work from time to time, even
giving
for a
them
period.
some flexible work arrangements,
Absolutely.
letting them work from home.
And when Lou says flexible work arrangements, she's not talking about the strict scope in the Fair Work Act.
No.
She's talking about being generous.
Yes.
And if you've got an employee, and I would have to say this would be the vast majority of your employees, who's worth investing in, and I'd have to say you probably should think that about all your employees, then you need to think about making those accommodations on a temporary basis and being clear about them being on a temporary basis. So we would suggest that that is one way you could manage the external stresses to the organisation. What I would also like to say about this external issue is that I often find, well, I shouldn't say often, but from time to time I find that an employer gets frustrated with the fact that an individual is having problems in their own work personal life, and it's affecting their work life. If you allow that to be a problem, then that's something that's going to snowball.
Yeah.
It's going to become a problem. So I think what you need to understand is let it go when it comes to stuff outside the workplace. See what accommodations you can make to help support them. Understand if you've got an EAP program, which is baseline for a lot of organisations, make sure they're getting in and getting some support from that. Make sure you've got your programs in place to support those individuals. But when it comes to workers' compensation, and this is why I made a bit of a fuss about workers' compensation before, those external stressors that might feed into a very low threshold trigger in the workplace can still cost you from a workers' compensation perspective.
Oh, absolutely. They can definitely cost you from a workers' compensation perspective, because once you're on notice of those issues, you need to act in a reasonable manner towards that person. And if you fail to do that, you're going to have a claim.
And we often find that, a person might have, as Lou's already talked about, a relationship issue outside the workplace, a family illness, some other family emergency, and the employer thinks, well, that's their problem, I've got my own problems. If you're an employer, you do have a very significant obligation, not just under the law, but as a person, to look after the people who are under your care in your employment. And that means trying to rise above managing your own issues, but also thinking about what they've got going on in their own personal life. Now, if it becomes too much of a problem, too much of a cost, well, that's when you lean on your external advisors and we can help you manage that. But today we're talking about solutions and trying to prepare for managing issues in advance of them becoming bigger issues.
Yes, always better to be looking out for the issues rather than trying to clean up the mess. When things happen, it's much more difficult to unscramble the egg.
I like that point. Yeah. So some common signs of stress?
Yep. Look, there's plenty of them. What do you need to be on the lookout for when people are stressed? Different signs and symptoms. You're going to see people who are having poor health, a lot of colds, flus, people who might appear quite tired because they're not sleeping properly. Other things you might be on the lookout for. Have you got employees who are constantly got headaches, migraines, backaches, other aches, stresses, all those sorts of things? But then there are other things that you need to be looking for as well. Is there someone who has previously been a very motivated employee who's now coming in and their level of motivation, their enthusiasm for their work has really gone down? That's potentially a sign that they're stressed. Have you got someone who has become extremely irritated, maybe aggressive and angry in their approach? They've withdrawn. These are all kinds of things that might be indicative of the person being in a stressful situation or not being able to cope.
We've also got up here behavioural as well, and that can be about people being short-tempered in the workplace.
Yep.
Becoming very emotional at a time when they're not normally.
And probably not proportionate to the situation.
Yes. We've got up here someone lying on a couch in terms of the little photo. That's probably no accident. I've had a number of cases involving people who've been sleeping in the workplace, both during work hours when they should be working and during breaks.
Yeah.
It's not normal for someone to climb under their desk with a pillow and to go to sleep on a regular basis. That's really not normal. It's not really appropriate workplace behaviour.
Yeah.
Have I felt like I could do it once in a while? Yes,
absolutely.
But it's not something that that really is okay, and it suggests that if someone's doing it more than once, that something else might be going on in their life, and it's worthy of a conversation, and it's worthy of organisations considering what measures you have in place, both in your policies and procedures and your mental health plan. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, to accommodate or address these issues. Because whilst I said that you have a great duty and obligation to look after your employees, at the same time, you're not a doctor.
No.
Well, you might be. If you are, then fantastic. And if you are a doctor, in fact, maybe it's one of those things that we say as a solicitor, you shouldn't really act for yourself.
Correct.
If you're a doctor, maybe you need external, and you've got a business and you've got employees who are potentially suffering from mental ill health, then maybe you need to have that external support, that arm's length support. But it all starts with you triaging it in the workplace in the first instance, identifying it, and then making sure you've got the measures in place. If you don't have the measures, then look around for what's available.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, as you were saying, it's a triage situation. You've got to be able to identify the signs of stress in the workplace. But also, if you have that initial conversation with someone and they say they're okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that you forget about it. The person might not be ready to have a chat to you about it at that stage. It might not be too serious, but it's certainly something you still need to keep an eye on.
So some of the benefits of preventing stress, some of this is a bit trite, but you reduce your staff churn. If you've got people who are feeling stressed in the workplace, you're going to find them looking for other jobs.
They will leave.
And if you've got people in the workplace who are suffering from mental ill health further up the chain, in terms of the managerial hierarchy, then you will also find people leaving not just because they're feeling stressed, but because other people are feeling stressed. And
it's filtering down.
It is.
Yep.
It will always filter down. You've also got, it's a bit obvious, but a reduction in absences and tardiness.
Absolutely. I mean, people who are stressed often have issues with sleep or lack thereof, which means that they need their days off to catch up, to have the mental health day that, is so common. So reducing those things is definitely a benefit to the employer and to the employee. Yeah,
and I think, you talked earlier about temporary absence was one of the issues you raised, Lou. And one of the tolerances you need to build in is to understand that while someone might be taking days off, because they've taken their 10 days off in a particular year or 10 paid days in a particular year, doesn't mean that that's a poor pattern of absence. So long as they're complying with their obligations around providing you with notice as soon as reasonably practicable after they become aware that they're not going to be able to come to work, as long as they're providing you with evidence that would satisfy a reasonable person. Now, that might be a doctor's certificate. It might not be reasonably practicable for them to get their hands on a doctor's certificate because, look, one day off for a migraine,
Well, I'd be at the doctor's all the time.
yeah, well, but it's not practical to
No.
expect someone who does suffer from migraines
To drive yourself to the doctor.
That's right.
It's not going to happen.
Well, it's not really sensible, and it's
Or safe.
That's right. So if you've got someone who you know suffers from migraines, and you understand that because they've given you a medical certificate that says at one point they suffer from migraines, then you need to have some tolerance around that as well. Obviously, if they're up to having 100 days off in a year, then that can be a problem for their ability to perform the inherent requirements of the job, and that's something you need to visit with your lawyers, your advisors. I say 100 days a year because I've had 2 cases like that in the last 12 months.
100?
100 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant.
It certainly is. You've also got, from a work health and safety, a workers' comp perspective, a reduction in lost time injuries.
Absolutely. And as we were talking about before, Joe, these types of claims involving psychological or psychiatric conditions and illnesses arising from work, they are high loss of time injuries. And it's the loss of time component which is going to be the most significant impact on your workers' compensation premiums.
And you've just got general improved health of your employees. Healthy employees are generally happy employees.
I would agree with that.
Provided there's not too much stress in the workplace, and that means you'll get increased productivity, and there's generally a reduced cost around claims.
Yes, and I think in terms of talking about claims and reduced costs, I think people are less likely to bring claims against their employers if they feel that they're taken care of.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think one of the things, one of the general bits of advice that I give our clients and members of the Business Chamber and other associations that ring in to talk to us is when you're dealing with your employees, a smile and a polite method of dealing with them goes a long way. Goes a really long way. And if you can deal with people respectfully, and you can control your own emotions as a manager and as an owner of a business, that goes a long way. I mean, today we're talking about things like mental health plans and other measures that you can put in place. But at the end of the day, it really does go a long way, being nice and being straight about things.
Yeah, and I think just, dovetailing into that, if employees feel that they have some kind of connection with their employer, with management, on more than purely a work level, that there's some kind of relationship of openness and trust there, that, they feel they can come to you and talk to you when things aren't going right. And if you've got that in the workplace, that stands you in good stead to manage issues before they become really big problems.
Now let's have a little bit of a chat about the mental health plan.
Excellent.
More and more businesses are putting in place mental health plans. Once upon a time, you'd find employers that were trying to keep as many or limit the number of policies and procedures they have in the workplace. I'm still an advocate of not having a policy unless you need something for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The more policies you have in the workplace, the more they become white noise or a distraction and less something that they'll become focused on. But having a mental health plan in itself, just having one is a great statement for your employees.
Absolutely. It says that you think mental health is important. And I think in having that mental health plan, it needs to be more of a two-pronged approach, which is, first of all, what can we do on an organisational level? But second of all, what can we do on a personal level? And assisting people under your mental health plan on a personal level has to be on a case-by-case basis because everyone's different. Everyone's symptoms are different, everyone's coping strategies are different. So you need to have definitely a two-pronged approach, I think.
And we're just going to talk about some of the things that you might have in your mental health plan. And Lou, some of where you were going just then was around tailoring the mental health plan to your workplace.
Absolutely.
They're going to be different for different industries. They're going to be different for different dynamics and cultures of workplaces.
Correct.
We couldn't dictate exactly what has to go into your mental health plan for your workplace.
There is no one size fits all with these mental health plans. And as I said, you definitely need to have an overarching mental health plan for the organisation and a strategy for managing mental health in the workplace. But also you need to have, flexibility in that plan where you will deal with people on a personal level to address their particular issues they're experiencing.
Yeah, look, certainly flexibility is vital. and I might just say at this point that, in fact, when we get to the end of today's session, we do have available for our viewers a standard mental health plan, which is a good base template, but it is a base template.
Yeah, definitely a base, but something that gives you a starting point that you can build on. But make sure that when you're building on it, you think about, what are the particular risks in our workplace? How can I put in place some barriers to ensure those risks don't affect people? Or can I remove those risks? All those sorts of things, but think specifically about your workplace.
So we'll remind you about that at the end of the session. And there's a small cost involved in that. And the plan we're offering is actually from HR Advance.
Correct.
And there's a great little document service, and it offers some other bells and whistles, HR Advance. But our firm has drafted those documents for HR Advance, so we support them and we stand behind those documents. But as Lou said, it's a great base template, but only a starting point for some businesses. For some businesses, it's a great start just to even get that base template in place. But if you can spend a bit of time going about doing what Lou said, specifically identifying the particular dynamic in your workplace and the particular needs of your workers, fantastic. So the first thing about this mental health plan is that it is about health and safety, and therefore there's an obligation on you to engage with your staff and consult your staff about that policy.
Well, it's very difficult to formulate a policy around mental health in the workplace if you don't have any feedback from your employees saying, these are some of the issues that we've experienced, this is what we think we need, and then you sit down and think about, well, what's reasonably practical and how we're going to deal with that feedback we've received.
And I have to say, just generally about policies, even non-work health and safety policies, and these days more and more policies fall into the scope of work health and safety, and therefore the consultation obligation is actually a statutory one. But I am a big fan of consulting employees more broadly about policies, full stop.
Yep.
And the reason for that is this. If you ask your employees what they think about something, then they feel like you care about what they say. And I know you do. But you're actually telling them that without saying it. You're saying, what do you think of this policy? It's a draft. We care about your mental health. Please tell us, excuse me, sorry about that. Please tell us what you think of, this particular plan. And you know what? Some of your employees will give you some really good ideas.
Absolutely.
Some really good ideas, and they might pick up a typo or two. Once you've done that, you don't have to adopt what they suggest.
No.
It might be too costly. It might be unrealistic. As I said, it might even be a great idea. But what you can then do is then implement that policy. And you're also sending a message. We're not telling you what to do.
No.
We're asking you what you think. And we're considering what you've thought. And this is what we've come up with.
Yep.
So give serious consideration to what people have to say about that policy, that plan.
I think as well, by consulting with people, whether it's on a mental health plan or other policies, by having their own say, they can take ownership of that policy because they've helped draft it. So they know what their obligations are, they know what supports are in place, and it makes them more invested in the process.
And Lou's covered off on some of these points already when she spoke a minute ago, but review what you've got in place at the moment. That's part of your assessment of the current cultural environment in which you operate. Consider what training needs you will have around this, because part of putting this plan in place will talk to what you don't do at the moment. And it'll also give rise to a whole range of measures that you might consider around training. And there's a whole range of trainings that you might put in place. Training measures might include even just some basics around bullying and harassment.
Yep.
It can extend to broader things around being nice to each other in the workplace. But the bullying and harassment training is one that can really also send a message to your workforce. We do some of that training, so please feel free to go and have a look at our website after we finish the session or at some other stage. And you'll see that we run bullying and harassment training. We do a general session. Lou and I do that training up and down the East Coast and wherever else you need us to be. And we do it in-house as well for businesses. But that's only one measure that you might implement.
Yeah. I find as well, I'm tending to do a lot of training now with managers in terms of how do we manage people with mental health issues How do we identify mental health issues? What are my obligations as a manager? What are my legal obligations? What are my obligations just on a basic level as a human being to this other person that I feel I have a degree of responsibility towards? So that's a big one.
It is. It certainly is. And if you can train your managers who, some of whom will have just progressed by the passing of time, happens in a lot of industries and a lot of workplaces, is that just because you've been there for a long time, you end up being a leader. That person may not be the best person to be in a leadership position, but they're just there because of the passing of time and circumstance. That sort of training, whether it's done by us or someone else, can be really helpful in helping them understand to be more empathetic and more accommodating of the challenges that people have outside the workplace. Some of the other things that Lou's already talked about, but I'll quickly talk about them because they're on our slide here. Be proactive about your workplace culture. And I think Lou was talking about that before when she was talking about when you do your assessment around your mental health plan. Consider what sort of a culture you have. Consider what sort of a culture you want to have.
And I think very important in terms of working out what your workplace culture is, you have to have your leaders acting in the way that they want the rest of their staff to behave. It's got to come from the top down, because if you're not seeing it in your leaders, then you're not setting the expectations.
Yep, walk the talk, talk the walk, and the fish rots at the head if you're not doing the right thing.
Yep.
One of the suggestions up here are buddy programs. That's something that's really good for people who start in the workplace. They're not only good for starters, but they also help forge longer-term relationships. Also, clarifying your expectations around your employees, that's something you can do through your consultation process.
Yes.
So rather think about your comms around floating out that mental health plan. Don't just send it out and say, here's our mental health plan, what do you think?
Yep.
Send it out with a bit of some objectives and some, what we'd really like to do is hear what you guys have to say. What we'd really like to do is put in place something that you think would help you with the challenges that arise in the workplace and in your personal lives. And I think you'll get some great suggestions. I've seen clients that have got some really good suggestions from their employees. They're a really good source of information. Yeah,
they're fantastic. And people having their opportunity to give their feedback, they're really, really happy with that. And sometimes it's a good idea, even if you're sending out your emails, have an open door policy. Say, come on in, have a chat to me if that's what you're more comfortable with. And I think you'll be surprised by the response that you get. Burnout's an interesting one. There were recently some changes from the World Health Organization where they brought out a new definition of burnout. Now, burnout's not recognised as a medical condition. The World Health Organization likes to call it an occupational phenomena. But when they talk about burnout and what it is, they still refer to it as being a condition which is resulting from chronic stress in the workplace that has not been successfully managed. So whilst it's not specifically a medical condition, it's still something that's going to impact quite significantly on the productivity of your employees, but more importantly, their health and well-being. So being able to understand burnout, to identify it and to manage it is very, very important. Very important. Now, a lot of managers need to be able to understand how to identify employee burnout. But more than that, we want them to be able to identify burnout before it's happening, before, when someone is on the path to burnout. So there are a lot of behaviours that you might be able to identify in the workplace as someone who is experiencing burnout or sort of reaching the point of burnout. Some of them are a bit similar to those that we talked about before in terms of stress, indicators of stress. But the World Health Organization has come up with some fairly specific criteria or indicators for someone who's on the path to burnout. The first one is that the person has become very cynical or negative about the workplace, about the colleagues, or about the work that they're undertaking. So when you're looking for issues of burnout, this is the prime thing you are looking for. Someone who has become very disenchanted or disillusioned with their workplace. Some other things you might be looking out for in terms of who might be experiencing burnout. You're looking at people who were once optimistic, who have become very pessimistic in their role. People who have withdrawn from their colleagues and the people in the workplace, clients that they engage with. You're looking at people who have had a significant reduction in the enjoyment that they get from work and who don't show any emotion in terms of good outcomes at work. So people who previously might have taken a lot of pride in what they do and now they're getting good outcomes, but they are not celebrating those outcomes. So these are the kinds of people who are showing to you symptoms of burnout. And there are, interestingly, some people who you can identify who are at risk of burnout. And the first one is our workaholics, okay? And I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anyone. But when I say workaholics, I mean those people who work is everything. They put everything into work, and because of it, there's an obvious disparity and lack of balance in the person's personal and work life. It's all work. So if you've got anyone like that, be concerned. Unfortunately, in a lot of organisations, people look at the workaholics and say they're my star performer because they get the job done. That might be true, but only for a time because they are on the path to burnout. Some other risk factors that when we're looking at burnout, what else have we got? We've got the employees who are the yes people. Always say yes. Yes, I'll assist. Yes, I'll do that. Yes, I'll get that done. It doesn't matter that they don't have the capacity to do it. And it doesn't matter the fact that the person who might be asking them knows that they don't have the capacity to do it. But they always say yes. So be aware of the yes people, okay? The other risk factor is personality. Now, being in the legal profession, we've got a lot of these people. They're called perfectionists. They're always setting very high standards, and then they just never meet them because they keep getting higher and higher and higher and escalating. So be on the lookout for your perfectionists because they're going to be extremely hard on themselves and harbour negative feelings when they do not reach the very high standards that they think they should be reaching. So they're probably some of the key risk factors for employees who might experience burnout. So what's going to be important for you as an employer? You need to be able to recognise the symptoms of burnout. And as Joe and I have already spoken about today, you want to make sure that by the time you get anywhere near this, you have built a relationship of trust and openness with your employees so that they feel that they can talk to you if they are experiencing burnout. If you see someone who might be on the path to burnout, then you need to talk to them. And as Joe and I were saying before, they might not want to say to you at that point in time, no, they might want to say, no, nothing's wrong, I'm fine, no, I'm good. And especially for a perfectionist, of course they're not going to say they need any help. But doesn't mean you don't need to keep an eye on them. If someone's showing the symptoms of burnout or if someone is at risk of burnout, then you, as their employer, from a work health and safety perspective, but as I've said before, on a human level, you need to keep an eye on them. Very important.
And as you can tell, Lou's very passionate about this particular topic. Being a lawyer in the legal profession, you were talking about people who are workaholics and people who...
I don't know any of them.
No,
never come across any of them. Perfectionists, workaholics. Yes, people. No, don't know any of them.
I think the other thing about we just want to say about this particular point is it's not just about looking for the signs of burnout, it's planning for burnout.
Absolutely.
And that means planning to mitigate against burnout happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, just before we came in, Lou and I were just talking about how in other countries they've got measures such as shutting down email.
France.
Or prohibiting email being sent after 5 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock at night, so that these workaholics are actually prevented. Now, I'm sure some people will find a way to continue to do their work.
They do.
But it is a measure that's put in place to mitigate against burnout. And that's really interesting from a country perspective, coming up with that particular code where businesses will have their emails shut down out of hours.
Yeah.
It's certainly something that a lot of us, particularly in the legal profession, could take a leaf out of that book.
But not you, Joe.
Not at all. But as I was just saying, I think you need to think as a business, how am I going to protect my employees and my business? So you protect your employees, and I get there are employees you don't want in your business. There are some employees that perhaps should move on and find another job. And we can help you with that.
Yeah.
But you've got this at two ends of the spectrum. You've got good employees who you will burn out, and that's a cost to you because they might file a workers' compensation claim, but they're going to leave. And if they leave, then you've got to recruit someone. So there's a cost at that end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who perhaps you want to leave anyway. You might not want to invest much time in them or effort, and therefore they end up filing a workers' compensation. So it's a lose-lose situation if you don't have measures in place to address burnout.
Yeah, and I think that involves looking at the psychosocial risks and being able to identify those and put in place some methods to either prevent the burnout or to completely eliminate any of those risks that are identified. And there's actually, with Safe Work Australia, they developed People at Work, which is a very interesting tool which is free online and steps you through how to identify psychosocial risks in the workplace, and gives you a bit of guidelines on how you might manage those risks that you identify.
Good tip, Lou. So, issues in managing ill and injured workers in the workplace. Now, today's topic is not about how you deal with the hard legal stuff around this, but today we're coming from a more positive spin about preventing mental ill health in the workplace or managing mental ill health in the workplace. And so some of the things we'd like to talk about is, can you make reasonable adjustments? And I think I already talked about this a little bit before. This is not the legal definition of reasonable adjustments. It's something that you do need to consider from a legal perspective when you're talking about someone with a disability in the workplace. That is a mental health or mental ill health issue in the workplace. But from a cost perspective, what's your threshold? You know, beyond that legal obligation, what reasonable adjustments or accommodations can you make to help your employees to make your workplace a healthier workplace? When it comes to dealing with an individual, we've advocated support today and being accommodating, but we're not advocating against being firm around conduct and performance.
No, I mean, I recently went to a mental health in the workplace seminar for the day, and one of the phrases that I took away from that is that mental illness is not a shield to conduct and performance issues. They still exist and they still need to be addressed. Yes, you might take into account the person's mental health issues when you are managing them, but it doesn't mean that conduct or performance issues are let go.
What is important when it comes to performance issues is that if it is a performance issue and you think and there's performance issues arising, and you know that there's a mental health or a mental ill health issue that may be impacting on that, and sometimes an employer will tell you that. Often we find when there's a performance management process, an employer has progressed to the final stage of a show cause, that is, show cause as to why your employment should not be terminated for poor performance. And the employee says, I've got depression and anxiety. My doctor, my GP has said, or my treating psychologist or psychiatrist has said, that is impacting on my performance. At that point in time, it doesn't act as a shield, as Lewis just said earlier. What it does do is it does act as a stop and prop moment, which means you need to consider, what investigations do I need to make here? And if that person has represented to you that mental ill health or is creating an impact on their performance, then you need to examine that.
Yeah, and it might not be that it makes a significant difference to the final outcome, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to understand the nature of the person's mental illness. You'd probably want some medical evidence that it's actually, you know, a diagnosed medical illness, because there's a lot of people who might wave up their hand and say, oh yes, I've got depression or anxiety or some other self-diagnosis based on how they're feeling. So you'd probably want to get some medical evidence. But when you're looking at conduct and performance issues, and particularly performance issues, if there's someone who's got to a show cause and have raised, whether it be anxiety, depression or whatever they might be suffering from, and you are able to verify that that's the case, and they've been with you for a long time and they've had no previous performance issues, then surely you're going to stop and think, is termination the right way to go with this person? Or can we work with them to get them back to where they were?
And I think you've mentioned the T word, termination.
Yeah.
We do find that when it comes to performance and mental ill health situations, that you are confronted with, particularly if you were talking about termination at the performance point of show cause, that may become a medical termination.
That's
and
right.
Today's not about how we step you through a medical assessment and how we end up going to a termination on medical grounds. And there are specific legal obligations around that. Lou mentioned earlier, and I've visited it once along the slides that we're talking about today, the temporary absence.
Yes.
And so that means that someone is permitted to be absent from work for a period of up to 3 months due to an illness. And if you're going to terminate them because they're not at work, they have that protection for 3 months, at least 3 months.
That's right.
It might extend beyond that if they have paid personal leave that extends beyond that period.
That's right.
Provided the whole period was paid personal leave. But it's a minimum of 3 months, including unpaid leave.
Yep.
That's the first threshold issue. The second one is whether or not the person is able to perform the inherent requirements of their job with reasonable adjustments, and or if those reasonable adjustments cause the employer unjustifiable hardship.
Yes. And I think when we're looking at reasonable adjustments, it's important to remember you don't have to find someone a new job. That's not the obligation. What you need to look at is, are there things that can be done in the workplace that will allow this person to do their job safely? And that's going to differ from employer to employer as to whether it's going to be reasonable or not. And you might be looking at things like the cost involved, how long the adjustment needs to be in place for. There's a whole range of factors. So again, it comes down to considering this on a case-by-case basis.
So, as I said, we're not doing a hard course today on the legal threshold issues, but
no.
we have to talk about them.
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's enough about that.
Yep.
And we've got some questions to deal with today, so we'll come to those.
We're getting pretty close on time.
Pretty close, yeah. So the benefits of having a return to work plan. So the first thing is the statutory obligations around the country from a work health and safety perspective, and then also specifically under workers' compensation legislation, is that you have to have a return to work plan
Correct.
Or program in place within your workplace. And what that gives rise to is that on an individual basis, you will have return to work plans for your employees as and when they have a workplace or work-related injury. Some organisations will have return to work plans developed also, and in fact it's good practice, for people who have non-work related injuries.
Yes.
It helps you comply with your legal obligations, it helps you manage the legal risk and the commercial risk around those injuries and returning them to the workplace, even when there's no work-related injury.
Yes, that's right. And definitely something that you would probably look to do for employees that have been with you for a long time, who have contributed to the organisation and who, but for this illness or injury, will continue to contribute.
And, as we've said earlier, that results, there's a constant theme here, reduction in costs, a reduction in lost time injuries, a reduction in costs of recruitment, and a reduction in just all-round claims.
And greater loyalty from your employees. They're going to put in if you put in for them.
Absolutely. And from an employee perspective, you've got a boost in morale, you've got employees who feel secure in their employment. Financial security is really important to people these days. Most people, for some reason, wish to have a mortgage because they want to own a house. And so they go around taking out loans.
The great Australian dream, that's what we do.
And the thing that supports that particular obligation is, of course, your work. And if they feel that they're uncertain in their employment, it creates almost a snowballing effect from a stress perspective.
Yep.
There's also, again, a reduction in other claims from a holistic perspective. And so what we'd say around return to work plans is make sure you're complying with your workers' comp obligations, and then which include this obligation to have a plan or a program in place that gives rise to return to work plans for work-related injuries, and then consider whether or not on a discretionary basis you want to be able to use that for non-work-related injuries as well. It really makes a lot of sense. Tips for managing workplace stress, Lou?
Yep. Well, I mean, this is, I suppose, a bit of a summary on everything we've touched on today. So, first of all, we want to look at identifying risks and hazards, and this really ties into your work health and safety obligations. As we discussed, you need to identify the risks to people's mental health and the development of psychological or psychiatric injuries in the workplace. What are those risks? What are those hazards? How do we manage them? We've then talked about the implementation of a mental health plan, which really ties in with most aspects of what we talked about today, but your mental health plan is basically about tailoring it to your workplace and also making sure that your employees are aware that mental health in the workplace is important to you. Thirdly, we've got training of managers. Now, Joe definitely touched on this before, and I think I've mentioned it as well. Training of your managers is essential. I don't think there's too many people who are born a manager, but there's plenty of people who become managers. And when they become a manager, I actually had an unfair dismissal a few years ago where there was a manager who had not been given any training in how to deal with people, and let's just say they lost their unfair dismissal and they got criticised highly in the witness box, and you don't want to be in that position. So it's very important to recognise that while someone might have good skills as a worker, it doesn't mean that that translates into skills as a manager and a leader. Employee assistance programs, so we've touched on this a little bit. The one thing I would like to say about your EAPs is review them. A lot of people don't actually think about or review how their EAPs are used, how could we improve our EAPs. So just make sure that that's something that you're looking at on a fairly regular basis.
We've also I've got up here on the list flexible work arrangements. We've talked about that today. Consider those, not just the legal definition, but the broader concept of what flexibility you can afford in your workplace to help what otherwise might be very productive employees to help them manage around their mental health issues or mental ill health issues. Always be reasonable. I talked earlier about being nice, being kind. That doesn't mean being soft.
No.
It just means being polite, being reasonable but firm when you need to be firm. Consider your legal obligations. We've talked a little bit about those, and we do a whole different webcast on the hard-edged legal challenges.
Yeah. I mean, you could spend an entire webcast on each of them. So
yes, well, an entire day.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, we do a day training course.
We do.
We do. And of course, and Lou talked about this earlier, right at the beginning of the session, and it's something that we think you need to consider. Even if you decide to take up the go and have a look at this mental health plan that we're offering today to businesses that are interested in purchasing it, is just consider a tailored approach for your business and your employees. Now, we've got some things up here about how we can help. We can help you with not the insurance side of your workers' compensation claim. We don't specialise in insurance anymore. Lou and I used to do that, but we gave that up for the broader holistic employment and industrial side of things. We can help you with return to work plans if you need that. In fact, we regularly help clients with return to work plans.
That's one of our key things that we assist clients on.
We can help in terms of mediation. Now, we don't do the mediation ourselves, but we've got lots of mediators on our panel. We've got we do investigations, but we also have lots of
external investigators
that we use as well. And we can also, as Lou's already said, help you with training your staff. Up here, we've also got our employment law fundamentals training in October. And we've got training sessions in Sydney, which I sometimes run, and some of the other guys in Sydney
and I'm doing the training sessions in Brisbane. And
Lou does the Brisbane sessions. And we've got our Newcastle team that run the Newcastle team. It's just up here also. The mental health plan or policy is a special offer for $245 with HR Advance. So there'll be a link at the end of the survey or in the resources section in the top right blue button. Now, before we go, I've got a couple of questions I think we should read. There's lots here, but there's one question here. When an employee confides with a peer that their stress is home-based issue but wants to make it a workers' comp issue, how can the company tackle the matter?
Oh, that's a difficult one.
So I've got a view on this, and this is quite a harsh way to deal with it, but I think you should. Now, I understand the employee's suffering from mental health, but they're doing something that's dishonest by the sounds of it.
Yes.
And the best way to do this is you get a statement from the employee who's told you about this. Now, a lot of employees will tell you, I don't want to get involved, I don't want to be a witness. Too bad.
It's your duty as an employee.
Absolutely. They need to get involved. It might damage your relationship with that employee to a degree, but you'll just have to manage that and manage it post the event as well. Get a statement for that employee. If you have to, take a detailed file note and send it to the employee and say, this is what you told me. It might be an email. At the end of that, you might then approach the employee who's made this threat and say to them two things. One is, this is not appropriate. Secondly, do you need some help?
Yes. And
engage with the employee about whether or not they need some help. What you've then done is provided a bit of probably the best protection for your company because you've put out to them exactly what they've been saying to another employee, but you've also, out of the kindness of your heart, despite them saying that they're coming after your business, you've said, no, actually, we're going to
help you.
We're going to help you.
Yep.
So that, I couldn't think of a better way of dealing with that.
No.
Another one is, and I had some time to think about that, Lou didn't. So, as an employer, should I offer myself as a buddy, or is there going to be issues you can see?
So is this, I'm not sure if you mean in terms of a manager being a buddy.
Yes.
Oh, look, I think it's going to depend on the circumstances, but I would say no to a manager being a buddy. The reason being is that I think it compromises the position of the manager to manage that person if and when it arises. I actually had recently a workers' compensation matter, psychological injury, where the employee's manager had really stepped in and acted as a buddy, as a confidant, as a supporter.
Messy.
And it did not work.
No, it usually doesn't.
And when it came to, crunch time where this person had had a significant amount of time off work, they then lodged a workers' comp claim, we needed evidence from the manager, things just went south. So I would say, unless it's very exceptional circumstances, I would say no, that's not a good idea.
One last question before we go. I know we've just gone over time. This is a good question.
Okay.
How can we tactfully suggest to our employee that he or she may be over-medicated as they are not functioning well? You do need to be very careful about this. But if you do have some objective signs that are being demonstrated that lead you to the subjective view that this person is over-medicated or under-medicated for that matter,
Yep.
So long as you have a reasonable basis for forming the view that this person has an issue, you might consider having them referred off to a medical practitioner. Don't engage with them and tell them that it's your view they're over-medicated or under-medicated. That is not appropriate. But you might say to them, we have these concerns. You might have a conversation with them about how are you going with this particular mental health issue. That's what the issue is.
Yep.
Have a conversation with them, see what you get that conversation. Do not suggest something that a doctor would suggest, which is whether or not you're taking too much medication or not enough. It depends on the signs that you're seeing, but if they are reasonable signs, you may really, and in fact from a health and safety perspective, you might have an obligation to actually have that person referred off to a medical practitioner.
I actually had a client that had to do that recently. They had an employee with a psychiatric condition, and the employee, according to word on the street with the employees, he was, upping and downing his dosage as he saw fit. And this actually manifested itself in quite serious symptoms in the workplace, falling asleep in work vehicles, driving the vehicles in wonky lines. So when the client came to me and we had that discussion, I said, well, let's just put to this employee what has been observed and say, we're concerned because we've observed this, let's get you off and have an assessment. And it's actually worked out for the best.
Great scenario. Well, Lou, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you to our viewers for joining us once again for one of our webcasts. Don't forget the mental health policy. And if you've ever got a problem,
you can come and talk to us.